Hey Axis and Allies players, the good captain here. Welcome to the fifth and final video in my Axis and Allies Europe series. This video will cover a range of different topics, so we'll do a quick agenda and then get to it. First, I'm going to review the end game board state and the run-up to that board state, and this will conclude the discussion around tactics and strategy for the game. We'll then discuss balance and recommended fixes for Axis and Allies Europe. After that, we'll do a Q&A, followed by shoutouts, and then close with my final thoughts and conclusion to this video and video series. To have a proper discussion on the endgame board state in Axis and Allies Europe, I've found it best to use AAA as a platform. So what I'm going to do now is transition to the computer, where we'll pick up off the last strategic video and go through everything in the necessary detail. Okay, welcome to Axis and Allies Europe on AAA. Let me take a quick moment and orient everyone to the board here. What I have set up is the same board state we had on the live board from the last strategic video. So all the powers have taken their first turn, and we're going to go into turn 2. Now the intent of this video is to demonstrate and discuss the end game board state and all the intricacies that go into that final turn. But in order to provide the full context and for completeness, I'm going to very quickly go through how the East Front might look between turns 2 and 5, and then how the Battle of the Atlantic and West Front looks between turns 2 to 5. So this is essentially a solitaire playing of Axis and Allies Europe, and for purposes of the endgame demonstration, I was mildly lenient towards the Allies. It's very possible that you won't have a lot of heavy or large-scale fighting between turns 2 and 5, but all the battles are very critical, namely because there's so little time. So anyway, let's get into Germany's turn 2. They'll go ahead and buy 31 infantry. So this is to pass on Sea Lion and go for Moscow. And in terms of combats, we are only going to be taking Finland and Ukraine, and then at the end of the turn, we're sort of just swapping out our armor that was on the front lines for infantry, and otherwise consolidating and bringing up our assets. The Russians respond by participating in the blocker wars with counterattacks up and down the line. Round 3 is the first turn where we have the Germans do a max armor build, and more of the same continues out on the East Front, just engaging in the blocker wars. And the Russians respond in kind, and then we get to round 4. Now, we'll discuss this in more detail in a moment with regards to what's going on in the Atlantic. Normally you would do another max armor build, but because things aren't going perfectly for the Germans, we invest in some extra infantry pieces. Again, we'll get to that momentarily. Combat is again more blocker clearing, and the Russians have to leave and pull back. Usually they'll pull into their capital, but that's not the best move. The best move is to remain in Turkestan and Russia, and that's to prevent any blitzing armor from going around the sides and gobbling up other territories. There's no need to go into the capital just yet, so let's dead zone the entirety of the Russian original territories by pulling into Russia and Turkestan. And finally, we get to turn 5, and the Germans just drive adjacent to the capital. The last tank build moves into East Poland. The reason I leave a single infantry here is because the Russian bomber is terrible at defense, but just fine on offense, and it's fairly typical for the Russian bomber to attack any stack of German tanks and trade a tank for the bomber. In this case, with an infantry present, that's not likely going to happen. The reason I keep an excessive amount of tanks here as Germany is in case I need to send more back to help defend the capital on Germany turn 6. The Russians then consolidate in their capital for the final battle, place their final units, and this is how we look for going into Germany turn 6 on the East Front. Let's take a look at the West Front. Okay, so this is the situation in the Atlantic. We still have 4 German U-boats, and the Germans should be looking to cause as much mayhem and casualties as they can for as long as they can and make the whole process of securing the Atlantic as painful as possible for the Allies. To that end, I move one of the U-boats to substall the USA transport here. I'm going to knock off the American destroyer here, and I'm going to eliminate this Russian transport with 2 of my submarines in preparation for knocking off the Russian convoy center the following turn. There isn't much in terms of wrong answers out here as the Germans. Just do everything you can to cause as much pain as you can while you can. Okay, so we submerged off the east coast. We trade with the destroyer down here west of England, and the German subs knock off the transport. So nothing too crazy happens here. The Russians go ahead and relieve the British convoy center, and then we get to the British turn, and one thing the Allies really need need to do is get transports going as fast as possible. You want to minimize the amount of warship construction to the bare minimum. We need to get transports going. We need to get all this dead income that's in the UK, the US, and Canada into the fight. And transports make all of these pieces relevant. So the quicker we can get them in the water, the better off we're going to be for what we're trying to do by turn 6. So to that end, we're going to buy 3 as the British. I don't have any combat. What I like to do is, if the USA transport is still alive at this time off of Canada, load the British armor into the USA transport so that they can move it across on the following turn. Otherwise, we just consolidate our assets down here southwest of England. When we get to the American turn, what we end up doing is buying 3 transports and outfitting them with troops and an AA gun. So we have 4 here at the end of the turn. That's the one that was sub-stalled plus 3 builds. We sent 1 sub to clear the British convoy center, and then there was a combat to kill that U-boat off the United States using a bomber and the destroyer. Okay, so now the Atlantic is far more secure. So when we get to British turn 3, what we're going to do is buy that 4th transport and then make sure the British have enough pieces to load out all 4 for the following turn. So we want to maximize our transport and unit efficiency. And then in terms of combat, we move to the Bay of Biscay and then load it into France. We really want to get pieces onto the continent as quickly as possible and start removing German IPCs. American turn 3 starts up, and the name of the game is transport and loadout efficiency. So we know this transport here is going to come back to the United States. So we build 2 more and then 3 artillery and 3 infantry to load out those 3 future transports. In the meantime, all the pieces on the United States are going to be transferred into England. So we look like this at the end of USA turn 3. On UK turn 4, we're now going to have to get into the channel here, and that means we're going to be in range of the rather large and respectable Luftwaffe. So I do some quick math and realize I'm going to have to invest in another destroyer as the British. We move into the channel with the British and blitz eastern France with the armor from France, and now we're in Netherlands, Belgium. The Americans are going to shuck forward with the 4 transports northwest of England and pull their troops in as well. So we look like this at the end of round 4. The USA turn 4 purchase was 5 artillery and infantry and 2 transports. So that means 1 had to come back from off the west coast of England. Just look at this situation right now. This is kind of a key takeaway. You're sort of shucking forward, but you're able to bleed back the odd transport every now and then. You want whatever you land in the UK to be moved across the channel on the following turn, but as you can see, the demand for more transports kind of slacks off turn by turn. So we have 6 transports in range to drop units into Germany or the Netherlands, Belgium, but we have only 4 transport loads worth of units on England. And finally, I want to highlight one other very, very critical rule that the Allies need to take advantage of, because we're about to do the same thing with the British here. And that is the ability of transports to carry 2 artillery. Each transport in this version of Axis and Allies can carry 2 artillery. So the UK turn 5 purchase is 8 infantry. I have 4 transports with which to transfer them over for the turn 6 assault on Germany itself. So that's really going to boost our attack into that territory on the following turn. And finally, we get the last of the USA pieces in position. The 5 artillery and 1 infantry are now in invasion position in the UK, and our launch point from the Netherlands, Belgium is fully stacked and ready to go. I'll pay some lip service on what's going on down in the Mediterranean later in this video. Suffice to say, it doesn't usually have a major and critical impact on this endgame board state. Before going into my turn 6 discussion, I just want to point out this finish fork here at the top of turn 5. This is what's going to help pin the German fighters and bomber in place and help restrict the German purchase options. Again, since the Allied fighters can either defend Moscow or attack Germany, the Germans must plan for both. And in the end, we end up leaving the Luftwaffe here. Yeah, at the end of turn 5, we look like this. So that's a good example of the difficulties and confusion that the finish fork can put on a German player. Let's get into the turn 6 discussion. When Germany takes its last turn, what we end up with is a fight in Moscow and a defense in Berlin. And the defense in Berlin is going to be 28 infantry, 4 armor, 6 fighters. The assault in Moscow is the bomber and everything else that could make it. And so when we run this calculation, we see we have an 85.5%. So I'm going to pull up a calculator and punch in 0.855. And then I'm going to run the calculations and see what would happen if the British hit us with all of their pieces and then the USA hit us with all of theirs. Of course, the British are not going to clear Germany on their own. What we're really interested in here is the units left if defender won. The defender's going to win, and most of the time they'll have something like 23 pieces. So when I configure a 23-piece defense against what's left from the Americans of 10 infantry, 9 artillery, a bomber, and the offshore destroyer, run the calculation, and it looks like there's about a 3% chance that the Western Allies clip Germany. So from the German perspective, we have a 97% chance to win this battle, and we need to win both. We really do need to win both, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So what are the odds of winning both as Germany? Well, if we remember back to 5th grade math, to get the right answer, we're going to take 85.5% and multiply it by 97%. And that is the percentage chance that Germany wins this game right now, 83%. So there's essentially a 1 in 6 chance that the Allies pull the win out in this game, which is not horrible. We all know how often AA guns shoot down bombers when they're doing strategic bombing raids. It's the same percentage. And so while I consider this the strongest and most viable evidence for this game being imbalanced, I'll also say that in my experience, this is a very skill-based version of Axis and Allies. In other words, if you have a German player that doesn't know all the ins and outs of this game, doesn't know all the rules, you can find yourself successfully defending Moscow or successfully capturing Germany, and you only need one or the other to win this game as the Allies. And I'm going to try to demonstrate that right now. So in this game, the Germans took Moscow with plenty of pieces remaining. The Western Allies launched their attacks and failed, but I'm now going to create a scenario where the Western Allies succeed with 1 piece remaining. And I consider this hypothetical that I'm about to demonstrate the last very important example in understanding of the rules with regards to Axis and Allies Europe. If this is the board state at the end of turn 6, or any turn where the Germans have captured Moscow and the Allies have captured Germany, the rules state that you must continue playing the game until one or the other capital has been recaptured. In other words, the Allies must recapture Moscow and the Germans must recapture Germany. The game continues until one or both of those goals has been achieved. And so in this board state, the game is not over. The Americans have Germany, but they can only build 6 pieces a turn here due to the industrial complex build limitations. The Germans have quite a large army, and these armor units move 2 spaces. And that's why it behooves an allied player to continue to build units through turn 6. Plan as if the war will continue, because it will if you've captured Germany, and the Germans are still on the board in force as they are here. The other thing to realize here is that when the Germans captured Moscow, all those IPCs went into the German bank, but when the Americans captured Germany, all the Russian and German IPCs now are in the American bank. So you can find yourself in a situation where the Western Allies have all the money on the board. So those are the rules of the game and how they affect the endgame board state. The most important thing to remember is that Germany must both capture Moscow and repel any attack on Germany to win the game. If either of those fails, Germany is very likely going to lose the game. And while these percentages seem to heavily favor the German player, this will become very important later in the video when we discuss how best to balance this version of Axis and Allies. Discussions about balance in any version of Axis and Allies is a sensitive topic. And in all of the versions of Axis and Allies that I've reviewed on this channel, I feel I have found a common thread, and that is experience. I feel that there are certain versions that are more susceptible to being balanced by experience than other versions, and I feel it's particularly true with Axis and Allies Europe. Now, I'll expand on that momentarily, but let me remind the viewers of my own experience with Axis and Allies Europe. I've played 8 different opponents, about 35 to 40 games prior to making these videos. And based off of that, it's my opinion that this version of Axis and Allies, when played between players with equally high experience in Axis and Allies Europe, that the game is imbalanced in favor of the Axis. To anyone that knows this version or played it back in the day, this isn't going to be anything shocking or new. In fact, I could use my demonstration in the previous video segment as Exhibit A, in this version being imbalanced. The assault on Berlin has a very low odds probability chance of success, while the German assault on Moscow has a very high probability of success. The counterweight to that, with regards to experience and balance in this version, is that there are enough special and unique rules to this version alone that the player who knows them and knows how to use them will have a decided advantage over the player that doesn't. And I'm saying this from personal experience. I played against one of those people that left comments in the little clip you just saw. And in the games where I was the Allies, I managed to fight them all to a coin flip. And needless to say, I was posting rules references to explain what I was doing and how I was able to do it. So while all versions of Axis and Allies are susceptible to this, not only understanding of the rules, but how to leverage them and make them work over the board in your favor, game after game, that player can create a decided advantage for himself. In this version of Axis and Allies, the Germans are far more intuitive to play. Conversely, the Allies are extraordinarily non-intuitive. Otherwise, with that caveat out of the way, yes, the game is imbalanced. If 2 grandmasters of Axis and Allies Europe sat down and played an out-of-box version, the German player is going to win at least 9 out of 10 of those games. And to me, it's from that particular level of experience that a game should be balanced. So here are my official recommendations for balancing Axis and Allies Europe. As a disclaimer, anytime I make a recommendation for balance in any version of Axis and Allies, I approach this subject as though I were a dentist and trying to fill a cavity in a patient of mine. I want to make the least amount of change possible and preserve as much of the game that was there originally. So to that end, here's how I would fix Axis and Allies Europe. First, I would remove the special cash advance for the German player. Next, I would remove 1 submarine from the Bay of Biscay. And finally, I would remove 1 armor from France. Once these 3 adjustments are made, I feel very strongly you have a very well-balanced game. So I'll close this segment of the video by describing why I feel that way. Given that Germany has to win both the battle in Moscow and defend Germany successfully, and given average dice across the lifespan of a game, we need to know what percentages are appropriate. And so the most balanced endgame is one in which the Germans have a 70.7% chance to win the fight in Moscow and a 70.7% chance to win the defense of Germany. When you multiply those 2 percentages together, you get a nearly perfect 50%. When you remove the special cash advance for Germany, it not only turns down the percentages of the Germans to win the Battle of Moscow, but it also turns down the percentages of Sea Lion being viable as well. But even still, after playing several games, it still seemed like Moscow was falling too easily, and the removal of an armor out of France helped contribute to creating a balanced situation. Conversely, on the other side of the board, by removing just 1 submarine out of the Bay of Biscay, you can increase the chance of the Western Allies successfully assaulting Germany to about 30%. My last note with regards to this segment of the video is that I understand that some players will find that special cash advance a real attraction to this game. If you're one of those people, my recommendation then is to let the Allies remove 12 IPCs of gear from the initial setup for Germany, and then allow the German player their 12 IPC special cash advance. So while my official recommendation is to remove it completely, with respect to those that really find that component of this game attractive, that's my solution. Let's now move to Q&A. Once the balance recommendations are implemented in a game of Europe, I feel that my strategic videos need 1 slight tweak as regards to Operation Sea Lion. With 12 less IPCs to invest in Operation Sea Lion, the Germans now have the ability to produce only 10 transports. And so even if the Italian fleet is in position, you're looking at something like a 69 to 70% chance that the Germans succeed in Operation Sea Lion. But now that the game is ostensibly balanced, that looks pretty good for Germany. So there are some slight reconsiderations with regards to the Allies' response to this. But first, First, I want to point out that the Germans have been reduced by 1 submarine. So there are only 9 total submarines out in the Atlantic as opposed to 10. The opener for Germany changes only in the Celtic Sea, where there's 1 less German submarine. This doesn't change the expected outcome for that battle. However, overall, the likelihood that a British destroyer survives somewhere on the board has gone up. So if a British destroyer survives to UK1, that's going to influence the decisions whether the UK should spend or save all their IPCs. Assuming there are no UK destroyers, there are several counterplay options as the Allies in this case. We can use the Russian, British, and American bombers to attack the large transport group. Alternatively, we can change the USA-1 purchase slightly, and instead of buying a submarine, buy 2 infantry, and ensure that the maximum number of infantry pieces that the USA can take over to the UK is 4 instead of 2. You could also just not spend any IPCs as the British, and that would shut down Operation Sea Lion. I think the bottom line up front is this, that once a game is balanced, there's actually a lot more considerations for both sides, and that would be part of the fun of playing a truly balanced game. Of all the strategies I've heard for really any version of Axis and Allies, this one is the most bizarre to me. I'm not quite sure how this developed into the be-all, end-all strategy for this game, but I have a sneaking suspicion. So let me first start by saying that this strategy gives the Allies the best chance to win Axis and Allies Europe. This primarily has to do with being the Russian player and being willing to expose your force to up to and including a 50 or even 60% chance of being destroyed. Generally speaking, a German player won't engage in something so fraught. If the game is truly broken using that strategy, a German player won't take anything less than 95%. Here's why I think that strategy became so popular and so prevalent after this game's release. And it has to do with the Allied strategy of building as many fighters as you can. The only strategy I recommend less than the German tank push to Moscow is the Western Allied strategy of spamming as many fighters as possible to deliver to Moscow for the final defense there. This is not the best use of Allied income. I think this is most obvious when you realize that the USA can't get any more fighters to Moscow after its second build phase. In other words, any fighters produced on or after turn 3 will not make it to Moscow. So whatever the USA player is doing on or after turn 3 with its IPCs, it's incredibly anemic, I would argue almost ineffectual to the endgame board state. What I think happened is that the German strategy of the tank push was so intuitive that the Allied players tried to counter with something equally intuitive. I can partially sympathize with Allied players for wanting to build fighters. It's far more intuitive than the transport shuck. Organizing and shucking for the invasion of France and the eventual assault on Germany itself is difficult and fairly non-intuitive. The bottom line here is that both strategies are frankly dead on arrival, especially the Allied fighter push to Moscow. The patriotic war rule, in my experience, doesn't seem to have a very interesting effect. It seems to infer that converting Western Allied units into Soviet units somehow helps the Allies in the game. My experience has been the contrary. You want Western Allied pieces, especially British pieces, in order for the Soviets to be able to can open and otherwise clear blockers more effectively. So in short, I don't think you should ever convert any British pieces out on the East Front. If or when there are American pieces in Russia, they're usually fighters and bombers, and I think there are some rare moments where converting these might make sense. But they're so few and far between that I think in general, it's best to not convert Western Allied pieces to become Soviet pieces. In games where the German players sent the Italian fleet west into the Atlantic, I found that they meet their demise rather quickly. The Americans can generally handle this in the following way. You build the minimum amount of warships and use the local air power to take apart and destroy the Italian fleet. And the knock-on effect of this is that the Allies essentially dominate the Mediterranean. So while it looks fun as the German player to do something like that, I think it's far more effective if you have the Italian fleet turn back into the Mediterranean to help keep Africa secure and potentially get into the Middle East and drain some of the IPCs out of the American bank. And with regards to this area of the board in competitive play, this seems to be a backwater. If there is a decisive winner, be it the Germans or the Allies cleaning one or the other side out, the direct outcome of that is an effect on that fight at the end game. The percentages are going to lean one way or the other based on who wins or loses down there. It's time now for some well-earned shoutouts. I had a slightly smaller play group going through this version of Axis and Allies, but it was a very highly motivated one. So my first shoutout, of course, is going to go to Ragnell804. This guy's contributions to this channel are far and away the most influential. He's absolutely the most talented Axis and Allies player I've come across, and I'm very thankful to have him. And though Axis and Allies Europe wasn't his cup of tea, he stuck right with it, and we got a lot of good games in. Another familiar name here is Victory First. Not only did he stack a bunch of games with me, but he also modified the Europe module to be more in line with the rules. The Middle East now works properly, and there's a lot of other changes that he made to make the thing run far more smoothly. Next is Dooman McGee. This is another talented player who helped me out with the 1914 series, and his specific contribution here was leaning into the Allied fighter push and doing everything he could to make it work and make it competitive. This was extraordinarily valuable to determining what actually would work better, the Allied fighter push or something else, in this case the assault on Berlin. He stuck with it and found some really inventive ways to get a few extra fighters into Moscow, and it really helped solidify what strategies work best. So a special shout out to Dooman McGee. My final shout out is for the guy who pushed me towards Europe. He's also the fellow who created that little theatrical video you saw about all the players talking about the Axis tank push, but his contributions over the board were far more critical. Quaspec has the honor of demonstrating the viability of saving your IPCs as Germany and always threatening Sea Lion. It took several games for our playgroup to finally realize the viability of that strategy. We thought for sure there was some magic counterplay as the Allies that would just torpedo the thing, but it is a threat, and Quaspec gets the accolades for truly uncovering that strategy for Germany. I actually have one more very special shout out. I want to give Carl7 special accolades. This fellow is someone who made comments about Europe back in the day around the tank push, and when I asked him to play a few games with me because I think I found some things that might challenge that status quo, he didn't hesitate. We played 4 or 5 games over the board, and his online persona is extremely nice. It's very difficult to find somebody who masters the art of being nice through text and especially the forum, but he was just a stand-up fellow, so a special shout out to Carl7. Okay, the time has now come to close this video and end this series. This series was my review of Axis and Allies Europe, and in it I demonstrated what I feel are the most competitive opening strategies for both the Allies and the Germans. Not only did we discuss the opener, but mid and long range goals for each side, and we closed the discussion on strategy here at the top of this video by discussing the endgame battles and board state. In this video we also discussed balance, how to rebalance Axis and Allies Europe, reviewed some common questions, and finally did some shoutouts. I want to close this series now with a final few comments regarding Axis and Allies Europe. I feel that this game was undeservedly tarred as one that was completely solved. So let me just restate that experience really matters in this version. An Allied player that knows what they're doing will give a German player a very solid run for their money, if the German player doesn't know all the rules just as well. That being said, I'd like to put this version in its proper place. This is a version that is best played if you only have one day to play Axis and Allies. I would say that this game has far more in common with Axis and Allies D-Day than any other version. Given that it's on a 6 to 8 turn timeline, you could probably get 2 of these done in one day. So if you only have a day to play Axis and Allies, and you've got somebody who hesitates to play D-Day because they can't build their own units, I would highly recommend Axis and Allies Europe. If everyone's equally inexperienced, I highly recommend using the balances that I've recommended in this video. It's a game with a lot of torque. Moves matter more in this game than they do in Global. The loss of an extra infantry piece matters more in this game than it does in Global. Value of the pieces, the results of each of the small battles, just has a larger impact overall. This is not a marathon version of Axis and Allies, this is a wind sprint. It requires a different approach, it requires a different touch. One of the things that I think makes Axis and Allies players most lethal is their ability to diversify their Axis and Allies portfolio. So if you're heavy into Global and 1942, I highly recommend taking a swing at Axis and Allies Europe. It'll force you to see things differently, problem solve differently, and this in turn will make you a better player in other versions. Okay, that's it for this video and for this series. Thank you for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.